Okay, thanks.
I will put some background music.
My name is Gloria Barrera, and I'm in Houston, Texas, and I'm very happy to be here to listen to this and participate.
Well, welcome. All right, thank you for joining us all the way from Texas.
That's right.
Are you also a ALAS member or a TALAS member?
I'm a TALAS member, absolutely. I'm
All right.
got the invitation through Rick Lopez.
That's wonderful. Awesome. It's a little something so that we're not, lots of people sign up.
Okay, we're 2:01 here. I think you want to let people know we're going to get started in a minute or?
Yeah, we'll be starting in about 2 minutes. Folks are starting to arrive. Hey, Eric, good to see you.
Hey, good to see you too.
Sabrina's here. So do we have anyone outside of California? Besides our friend from Texas? Eduardo, how are you?
Doing very well. Good to see you all.
Good. All right, Florida's here. All right, 1 minute and get started. And folks will be joining us as they join in. Some folks are not on video, some folks are on video. Everything's welcome here. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? If that's okay with you, Ken, can we get going?
Yes, please.
All right. Well, welcome and good morning to all of our CALSA familia, ALAS familia that are joining from all over the country, and others that are joining us for the first time or returning from our state of California. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a special edition of our summer series. Today we'll be uncovering hidden inequities. I have the honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Jeanette Chien, who is the Assistant Superintendent of Learning and Leadership at San Diego County Office of Ed, and a long time valued CALSA member. Just a fun fact about Jeanette, and we were talking about this earlier. She's a USC Trojan and a UCLA Bruin, which is pretty neat here. Also, our host this morning is Ken Spero. He's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and a CEO of SchoolSims. Ken has implemented computer-based simulation to build resilience, leadership skill, and decision-making capacity in large numbers of educators and administrators throughout the state of California and throughout the country. So Ken, I know you have an interesting and engaging setup here for us. So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about that?
Well, actually, I'm going to ask Jeanette to start. The focus of the conversation will be around equity. And so we'll begin with that, and then we'll into the exercise in which we'll present a simulation and approach that will actually hopefully provoke interesting conversation amongst the group, as well as having an experience with the technology. So Jeanette.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm so privileged to open up today's conversation, and that's what we'll have in just a little bit. We'll have some opportunity to have some conversation about the notion and concept of equity. I just wanted to share with you a little bit about what we're doing in San Diego in regards to equity. I oversee a large division, and one of the departments that I oversee is the equity department. And as many of you, we're working really hard to respond to the inequities that haven't just been part of the system for quite some time, but also we're responding to the inequities that are bubbling up and are showing up, I think, a little bit more in terms of our distance learning approach, and just really looking at those families and communities that have access to quality instruction during this difficult time. And so part of the work that we've been doing in our equity department is really reaching out to leaders, reaching out to district officials, principals, and teachers in regards to how do we address the needs of the students that we know are most underserved and our most vulnerable students. And one of the things that we're recognizing is that, as we probably all know, that equity has always been a notion that we need to address. And because of what's happening with COVID and the racial and equity injustices that were coming to light, we're recognizing that there's a greater need for leadership and for people to make decisions about the systems that we have, that we serve and that we lead, and that we really need to break down some of those inequities and address them really head on. One of the conversations I had with Ken and a couple other people just recently is, how are we going to be intentional about addressing equity and not just have conversations and bring people to the table to have these difficult conversations, but actually put action to those words. And so, having gone through a lot of the difficult things that you're all going through, and as far as planning for reopening of schools, and as far as thinking about how do we serve our most vulnerable students, I think this is a great opportunity to think about how we create structures, policies, protocols to really look at how we do school differently, not just for all students, but really intentionally and strategically for those kids that we know already have achievement gaps, have access gaps, have opportunity gaps. And so I think, again, this is an opportunity for us not to just look at ourselves as individuals and really address head on the issues of equity. I know, and again, we talk about this all the time in our equity department, that it's important for us to look at ourselves as individuals and address our hidden biases, some of the things that we carry as far as values, perspectives, opinions. That's really critical that we do that as leaders. But also as leaders, I think it's really critical that we collaborate with other leaders, that we think about strategically, again, how we put together action plans to address those things that we know are hitting us straight in the face right now. And so it's more than just looking at equity through the lens of how we change ourselves as individuals, but also how we put together spaces and put together collectives so that we address equity in this collective manner. And so I think, again, having worked with Sims and some of the simulations that Ken has put forth, it's a really great opportunity for leaders to look at having conversations about equity without really feeling threatened, because that's, as we know, having difficult conversations about equity is sometimes having people put themselves in vulnerable positions, and being able to participate in something like conversations within the context of a sim creates a safe space to do that. And I think it also empowers leaders to have those conversations with one another. So again, that they build that collective understanding about what is equity, why is it important to address, and then how do we tackle it head on with very concrete actions. And so I just wanted to set that context that we know that it's really difficult. It's always been difficult to address equity, but even more so right now. And I think most of us in CALSA and ALAS have always done, what we have to do to make sure that our kids are served. And this is a great opportunity for us to come together, have the conversations, and really make change for our kids. So I'm gonna hand it back over to Ken so we can go ahead and get started with our sim.
Thank you, Jeanette. That was great. Thank you. And just to kind of go with that, and not to obviously modify that in any way, but just to talk about how we're going to engage in the importance of the intentionality. The idea of simulation is, well, first of all, as Jeanette mentioned, it's opportunity to engage in a safe place. So this is going to be, we're going to be making decisions about equity-related decisions in a school, in a district, but it's not your district per se. So it's an opportunity to surface things that maybe we've thought about but haven't spoken about, things along those lines, and we'll talk about that just real briefly in a moment. But it's important also just to recognize contextually, where simulations, this whole idea, we know how important they are for things like military and aviation and in healthcare, where those are high stakes arenas. And I would suggest that schools, K-12, none of those are higher stakes than what we have at risk with our kids. And so the opportunity to engage in experience, the opportunity to think about things, not from the instructional perspective, which is important, but the fact is, it's not often knowing the right thing to do, it's being able to do it. And sometimes that takes courage, sometimes that takes being thoughtful, and sometimes it's just really hard because the fact is that not everybody's going to agree. And so the way we learn from experience is actually by making mistakes. But when it's actual real kids at stake, or it's our staff members, we don't want to make mistakes then. Here's a safe place to make mistakes. Here's a safe place to try things out in which there's not going to be a risk of anything other than seeing what happens. So really what we talk about in the idea of a simulation, when we talk about this idea of learning from experience, but manufactured experience, if you will, is really to have an opportunity to create a realistic context. So again, we want to provide an opportunity for participants, for you all, to be able to engage in a context that may look like your building or may look like your district, but it's not. And so things may not go exactly the way you expect them to go, and that's okay, because here, in this instance, if there's a difference, sometimes it's a difference in context, it's a difference in relationships, it's a difference in demographics, it's a difference in all kinds of things, and it's important to be situationally aware as that pertains to situations, in particular with equity. And so this is the kind of manner in which we will engage, and I don't want to take the time to go too deeply into this, but really it's an opportunity to engage in decision-making, in being thoughtful, but also to deal with consequences. We are going to be, one thing that's clear is that we're not going to get it right? I mean, it is absolutely 100% clear you won't get it right, because even if you do things right by a student, the staff may not like it, or the parents may not like it, or the district may not like it. So the fact of the matter is that when it comes to dealing with making decisions within equity, it's important to remember that the goal here ought not to be to make it to that everybody feels good, right? Because it's just not going to happen. In working in this space, it's pretty clear that when we're making decisions, the group of stakeholders that we have, as I just mentioned, will rarely agree on things. And so what we need to be able to do is exercise good judgment. We need to make the best decision we can, but at the same time, we need to be resilient, because that parent may stand up at a board meeting, that parent may come into your office and start, or pick up the phone, and you just have to deal with it, right? So we have to be resilient enough. We have to be, I hazard to say, courageous enough, because it's courageous enough in so many other instances, but to be able to make those decisions and be prepared for the blowback. Because one thing, again, that we know for certainty is there will be blowback. And so two of the key skills that we look at developing in whatever context, but especially relating to equity, is on the one hand, good judgment, and on the other hand, being resilient. And I just enjoy sharing this slide, so you'll forgive me if I take a moment. This was a study I came across, this was the 2009 version, but they look at the 15 global challenges facing humanity. And this was quite a while ago. And you can see the things that you'd expect to see around the globe. But what I found most compelling, and certainly related to this issue, is number 9 near the bottom of the globe. They identified a global challenge facing humanity is our ability to make decisions. And what we begin to see is, on the one hand, you know, it's easy to actually, it's kind of surprising on the one hand, but then on the one hand, we have so much data that we can become paralyzed by, you know, the opportunities for analysis. And on the other hand, there's so much transparency. We're half a step away from being a headline that it's pretty scary stuff. And so it's difficult to make decisions. But on the other hand, and this is a deep slide, so I'll give you a moment to process it. As human beings, sadly, we are mindless, habit-forming creatures, right? Critical thinking, as most of us know, is not a natural skill. We have to work at it. And sometimes our rote responses that may be based on bias or not can actually be the wrong choices. And we need to be thoughtful. We need to be critical thinkers, because just making something a habit so we don't need to think about it is rarely going to be, is going to not well serve your constituents in any way, shape, or form. So that's really the goal of the exercise, the goal of the opportunity to engage in whatever topic, but certainly in a problem of practice such as equity, in which the important aspect is that we realize that we individually have to be intentional, but we also want to be intentional with our colleagues, because each of us have a unique perspective. And that perspective, for the most part, is valid. And it's just maybe a different way of looking at things. And so the opportunity to engage in conversation with peers about a meaningful issue, about how to proceed, about how we can collaborate together, because implementation, you can't do it alone, right? These are not things that we can do on our own. And so the opportunity to engage in this way is what we'll hopefully engage in this exercise. So let me open up the sim. So hopefully everybody is seeing my screen. As you will see in the upper corner, this was done actually in partnership with ALAS. This was the superintendent, aspiring superintendent leadership group with Jose Leyva that we collaborated with on this scenario. And again, what we've done is created a context in which we're going to engage in equity-related decisions, and we'll see how things proceed. So with that, I will let the simulation introduce itself. Oh, well, first, one of the things that's important in having experiences is living it, right? If we make mistakes, you got to deal with it. And so there's no back button. So if we make a mistake, if we make a decision that maybe isn't the best decision, it's okay, because that's what we can do here, but we will actually deal with the consequences as they play out in the context of the school district that is in the simulation.
In this simulation, you will assume the role of a principal supervisor seeking to ensure equitable learning opportunities for students of color within your network. In this role, you will face challenges, make decisions, and experience the consequences of your choices. You will also have opportunities to reflect on the way your beliefs about racial and ethnic equity inform your decisions, and to practice framing messages about equity to various stakeholders. In this simulation, we've created a dashboard in the upper right corner of the screen to show you how your decisions impact principal, board, and parents. These are important stakeholders that your choices will influence. Mouse over each row of dots to see its name. The colors will change from time to time based on your choices. Green suggests you're managing them well, yellow means not so well, and red, well.
So the opportunity here is really one of the things we want to point out is that in many decisions that we make, there are going to be trade-offs. That's what makes them difficult, right? There's positives and there's negatives associated with the decision. We can't escape it. There's no, rarely are we going to find that yellow brick road that if we just follow it, it takes us to wherever. And so it's important to understand what those trade-offs might be. And sometimes it's stakeholders, right? Because we can make decisions that delight one stakeholder and yet really upset another. And that's just something to be cognizant of as we proceed through it. And we give some insight into that as we go through the decision-making process.
You're beginning your first year as an associate superintendent in the Long Valley School District after serving for many years as a principal in a neighboring district. You support 5 high schools, most of which are struggling to raise academic performance and graduation rates, especially for students of color. You are considered fortunate to get this assignment because one of the schools under your supervision, Monte Vista High, is highly regarded for its emphasis on project-based learning as well as its student outcomes. Administrators from this and other districts visit regularly to review Monte Vista's processes as well as observe their teachers in action. Monte Vista is known for boasting higher graduation rates and excellent performance data. It is also the one school you oversee that serves mostly affluent white students with much smaller populations of Latino and African American students. The principal there, whom you've met a few times, has already let you know that she wants to be helpful to you as you get settled in your new position. Before meeting with principals, you want to identify specific areas where equity efforts might get traction at each school, as well as between schools. You decide to subtly indicate your priorities by carefully identifying the types of data and analyses you request from the principals. What data indicators might you ask them to gather and review? In the space below, identify as many as you can in 3 minutes.
So one of the things we're going to do is put you into breakouts so that you can have some discussion. Here, we're not actually making a choice, a decision, but it is to identify what are the data, what type of data would you want to gather as you would be engaging in this effort within the system. It's one thing that I do want to point out is that, just kind of as a sidebar, if you would imagine this in your schools or in your districts or with your teams in a PLC, the opportunity to engage in this kind of, now we're provoking this kind of opportunity for thinking and sharing of thoughts, that's kind of what the opportunity is relating to the deployment of this modality. So for now, I'm going to open up a breakout room. I'm going to automatically assign. So hopefully, please remember that when you are assigned to a room, please remember to join. And we'll see you back in a few minutes. So identify, if you would, a few items that you would want to gather from a data perspective, and then we can share out upon return. Don't forget, you have to click on join if you're available to join to go into the breakout room.
You decide to review data on graduation rates at your assigned schools. You notice attendance and registration patterns, as well as graduation rates across your
quick list, but we got a bunch of things.
Okay, welcome back. I'm sorry if that ended up cutting off some of the discussion. And one of the things that is that we hope for, these are, if some of the people in your group you know, obviously this conversation can continue, and certainly it can go beyond our limitations here in the webinar. But would anybody like to share some of the items that that came out?
Patricia Trejo here from Florida, School District of Palm Beach County. In my group, what I was sharing with them was access to programs, enrichment programs. You know, I'm a district administrator now, but I was a principal. And so I was always looking for data to see the number of kids of color that were in like gifted programs and our accelerated math programs. So I would look at those areas to ensure that we're giving opportunities and access to students of color.
Great, thank you. Anybody else from another group want to share? Okay.
We talked about a lot of things like our master schedule, things like just seeing the equity, you know, how many advanced, how many remediation classes, what kind of students are in those. I know that what I'm looking at for my school, and I have 96% Hispanic kids, but just the counselor, the individual counselor, are some counselors getting better results, and what are those practices that those counselors are using so we could uniformly use it across our whole system?
That's great. And one of the things that's you know, that you're pointing out, right, is the context, is your context, right? It's different than this context, and probably different than some others' context, which is that, you know, there are going to be things that are going to be more compelling, which are really, really important to you and may not be the most important, at least not on the surface, to others, but hearing from you and realizing that, oh yeah, so the opportunity to hear, again, those different perspectives based on different contexts, because there's no universal answers here that are obviously going to be appropriate. That's great, thank you. And you know, this is a, you know, again, depending on time, one can navigate, depending on how you're blending this into other work, could determine how much time you spend in any particular decision point or any particular area, because what we want to really provoke, the important aspect of the sim is not to finish the sim, it's actually to provoke this kind of meaningful conversation. And so, you know, we obviously are working in the context and the confines of this webinar, but in terms of where this can go and the kind of discussion that we like to provoke and the kind of discussion that you can provoke, because what we also want to do is then translate it into, now what do we do in our school? What do we do in our district, in our system, whatever the case may be? But, so as a next step, you decide to review data on graduation rates at your assigned schools. You notice attendance and registration patterns, as well as graduation rates across your schools. There are slight performance and graduation rate increases over prior years, but it is clear that there's still much work to do. Then you notice something surprising and disturbing at Monte Vista, your model school. There appears to have been a significant number of Latino males enrolled at the end of 9th grade who didn't return at the beginning of 10th. Are Monte Vista's graduation rates as high as they are because these students are leaving?
In your first official meeting with Superintendent Williams, you raised the issue of the male Latinos not completing high school and graduating. Superintendent Williams responds,
I know this has been an issue at Monte Vista, but to be perfectly frank, there are more pressing concerns right now. Of the 5 schools you oversee, this is the one we were least worried about. Are there some quick wins you could accomplish instead as you begin to develop a relationship with the principal there? Maybe you could look at increasing the attendance rate.
So one of the things what we want to do with this is obviously you get to know some of these characters because that creates some richness to the context. And so now we have one of those stakeholders who's now been identified and shared his perspective on.
You receive reports from your other 4 schools that indicate all are working on equity in various ways. 2 are focusing on developing cultural competence among staff members who work with young male Latinos. 1 is trying to help staff begin talking about race. And 1 is focusing on recruiting teachers who are more reflective of the student population. All are concerned about student performance and interested in receiving your guidance and feedback on whether these are the right things to work on right now. Given where your 5 schools are, how will you approach your first monthly meeting with the principals?
Okay, so here we are now at our first decision point. So what we have is an opportunity. We're going to have to make a decision, right? So we're going to have to make one of these choices. And I clicked on the little eye there, which gives us a little bit more insight into what is involved in that choice. And the way we're going to do this is, what I'd like to do is ask you each to grab a pencil or pen, piece of paper, or what have you. And as you look at these, I want you to write down what you would do. I'm going to open up a poll so that we'll get a sense of what everybody's thinking individually. And then we'll go into the breakouts to talk about it. And then we're going to get some insight into maybe some different choices that are being made across the group. So think of this as answer 1, answer 2, answer 3, and answer 4. So answer 1 is to demonstrate your accessibility and open agenda by simply letting them ask questions that are on their minds. Right? So you're going to have this meeting with the principals and you open it up to questions. Or B, you clearly state your goals and orientation toward equity. Right? So name what equity means to you and identify what you see as key priorities for the year. So you actually open it up with your perspective and then you'll go from there. Or answer 3 is to ask each one to prepare a short presentation on his or her school. Keep the meeting focused on the principals and their schools. Okay, so we ask them to do something to present to this first meeting. Or answer 4 is ask principals to identify specific problems they struggle with that have roots in equity. Open sharing of problems and issues will create an atmosphere where change can accelerate. So what do you think? So think about this for a moment. You can write down on your paper 1, 2, 3, or 4, and then I will open up the poll and we can vote. So there's going to be a few more because we're doing one generic poll. So even though there might be 6 options, please just do 1 through 4. Actually, you can actually do 5 if you don't like any of these answers, and I'll respond to that in a moment. Okay, I'm going to launch the poll now. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay, so about half of you have responded. So we have right now a distribution across all 4 choices. We'll give it another 10 seconds. Okay, we're going to end the poll now. Okay, so you can see the results. And again, one of the things, so clear number 4 is to ask principals to identify specific problems they struggle with that have roots in equity. Although answer 3 did have a number of responses as well as the other 2. The reason why I suggested the opportunity for number 5, even though it's not listed, is because you may have a different idea that isn't amongst these, and that's great. And sometimes, in fact, when it comes to a simulation, if there's an obvious choice, we won't include it. Why? Well, because it's obvious, right? And if that's the option, then of course you'll choose that. And really, this is an opportunity to think about, well, what happens if the obvious choice isn't actually an option, right? What if we can't do that because of constraints in the circumstance? So in terms of, again, provoking that opportunity for critical thinking is a wonderful opportunity. So given that, I'm going to close this for a moment. And I'm going to put you back into the breakouts and to discuss this and talk about what you did and why. And I'm be interested to see if anybody after this actually changes their mind. So I'm going to open up the breakouts and please remember to join and we'll see you shortly. I got muted. So I apologize if it ended up cutting off anybody in meaningful discussion. And again, I encourage that to continue by all means. And as the issues are raised, and I am curious if, and maybe anybody wants to, if people find it compelling, was anybody, based on, if you recall what you had chosen, was anybody convinced to change your choice? You want to do something else? And the reason why we do it this way is an opportunity to actually, you know, for people to reflect on the opportunity of their own biases, right? We're all biased creatures. We can't help it. We have biases. The question is what we do about it, right? We don't have to be governed by a bias. We can actually still be reflective and make good decisions anyway. And so here's an opportunity to reflect on, you have an approach, and then hear a different perspective, and again, see if that in fact changes. But in the interest of time, we did go with the opportunity for number 4. And one of the things that we find with experience is that, you know, we know that experience is the best teacher, but really that's true in instances where in fact we have the opportunity for reflection, right? When we put our hands on the stove and get burned, if we don't think about why that happened, chances are we'll get burned again. So the opportunity for reflection is very important, and therefore the sim will actually give feedback at the end to provide insight, as well as feedback you might get from a mentor, a coach, a facilitator, etc., as you're progressing through this. And so the opportunity to come back on that choice, and those of you who picked one of the other choices, you always reserve the right to do the I told you so's or what have you as part of the experience.
Your choice to ask principals to identify problems they face that have roots in equity completely silences any communication. The principals resemble deer in the headlights. Each looks at the others for cues on what to do next. It's obvious your request for candor is based on a level of openness and trust that has yet to be established. Perhaps your initial expectations are a bit optimistic. Not wishing to prolong the silence and discomfort, you decide to defer the difficult conversation about equity-related problems they currently face. For your next meeting, you'll need to pre-publish an agenda that gets everyone to open up about equity-related issues and launches that discussion.
It's important to recognize that sometimes, right, your choices are in a context, right? A good choice, but from an implementation perspective, has to take into account relationships and the other people. And so a possible challenge is just recognizing how that plays out relative to decisions that we're making. And for now, we are maintaining kind of people are not comfortable, but they're not totally uncomfortable with respect.
What are you going to do next about Monte Vista High?
So we did have that piece of data that we had gathered about Monte Vista. What are we going to do? So here we get to another choice. So we can gather more data on Latinos at that school and compare Monte Vista's trends with your other schools and present the principal with the facts in a direct manner. Looking at data on academic performance, discipline, placement in special ed, and access to advanced placement classes will help her become aware of the situation and take ownership. Or answer number 2, engage your associate superintendent peers in a discussion of your findings. Perhaps they will find similar trends and you can brainstorm how to address them. Of course, you only address 5 of the schools. Your colleagues address the rest of the schools. Or answer 3, talk with Mrs. Romero, who is the principal, about what you've noticed and see how she responds. Be prepared to coach her on this issue. Or answer number 4, approach Superintendent Williams to discuss the issue once more. Take another stab armed with more data. What do you think? So think about answers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And again, I will release a poll in a moment. You want to write that down? I will launch the poll in 5, 4, 3. Oops. Okay. Go. Oh, excellent. Okay, we have an answer 5 this time. Okay, we will close the polling in 10 seconds. Okay. You can share the results and you can see that for now, it seems that answer 1 was the selected route to gather more data at the school and compare Monte Vista's trends with other schools and present the principal with the facts in a direct manner. So gather the data and work directly with the principal. The person who answered number 5, if I don't know, if we got one person, so I won't do that. It's helpful when we have more than one. We don't necessarily want to call out, but what the answer might be, if these 4 you don't like, what might that 5th answer be? And one of the things that we often do is also to say, which decision would you never make, right? So in this case, everybody found a reason to make any one of these choices, but is there something that you really would say, no, I would never kind of do it that way? That's not a good way to operate. And again, in the interest of provoking that critical thinking. But before we make the actual choice and see what happens with the consequences, I'm going to stop that. I'm going to close this, and I'm going to put you back in the breakouts briefly and discuss this again and see if anybody share how you approach this and what your thoughts were in the decision, and then we can proceed from there. Okay, welcome back. Anybody like to share what some of the discussions that you had in your room?
Sure, I'll jump in. This is Monty Owens from Hooper Unified in California. And ours, we kind of were stuck on 3 and 4. I was thinking 3 because I thought the principal may be able to give information, just, kind of, they know what's happening at their site the best, and they have some understanding of why that trend is happening with the data of the Latinos leaving after 9th grade. But my colleagues shared that they approach 4 because if you're looking at something in equity, you have to approach it and really start and to make it a priority at the top so that the change can happen system-wide. And so to go straight to the superintendent again to discuss the issue, that this is something that needs to be addressed to make it an issue, because if the superintendent's on board and the school board's on board, then it's easier to get the change happening at the school sites as opposed to trying to work the other way.
That's great. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. One of the things that's interesting about what you were saying is, and I'm guessing that the difficulty is, each of us is thinking about our own superintendent, right? And or our context, or our communities, or the principals that we're interacting with. And one of the things that, having done this kind of work for quite some time using simulation, is it really allows you to reflect on the importance of the implementation aspect or the challenges, and how, equity is an issue by itself, obviously, but more importantly, it's actually, as part of being an effective leader, equity needs to be a strong component of that period, right? There's no time where we have in our moment in our day where we are stepping into an equity moment that nothing else is at play. So effective leadership actually incorporates this way of thinking and how it should govern how we're going to approach things. And thinking about how we then link to, these are some stylistic differences in terms of how you influence people, right? Or how you engage with people. So what are the key differences between answer 1 and answer 3? They both involve working with the principal, but the key difference is that you're sharing data with her, or taking the time to gather more data, which, if that's something that, if you know more about the person and she's more influenced by data, that's great. And the question is just knowing, having these insights as we're implementing, right? Just as it's important to know what's going to, getting the superintendent aligned behind you may help things dramatically, but the opportunity to be thinking about not just what you need to do, but as you're thinking about the manner in which you're going to do it and the people that you're doing it with, this becomes an important aspect of the decision-making, because clearly that could actually derail an effort, as a wonderfully thought out effort, because of the fact that somebody gets in the way, somebody sabotages it, somebody inadvertently, right? It can be positive or negatively driven, but the opportunity to be incorporating, to blend these various elements in terms of how we actually get it done. In the meantime, though, we did vote on, the vote was choice number 1. So we'll go with that, and let's see what happens.
You've gathered additional data on the Latino males who remain at Monte Vista and compared it to trends across your schools. You notice that there's a significant drop in achievement after their first year at school. What's more, the Latino males at Monte Vista seem to be dropping behind as they move from grade to grade. At your other schools, this group's performance usually improves or remains steady from year to year. You've scheduled a meeting with Mrs. Romero to share all this information.
Okay.
Yes, I'm familiar with the data, and I must say that I and all the members of my staff work long hours dedicating ourselves to providing all our students with appropriate instruction. However, my staff are not miracle workers and cannot make up for the challenges many of my Latino males face because of poverty, balance in their communities, insufficient preparation in middle and elementary school, and a host of problems outside the zone of our influence here at Monte Vista. To be fair, we We have made several small equity initiatives here at Monte Vista, but they were curtailed due to budget cuts.
Okay. Well, we have some more information.
Given what you've heard up to this point, how will you prioritize your time? Choose your top priority from the list below.
Okay, so again, this is just the top priority. One of the things that we look at in a simulation is the opportunity to actually, when we think about implementation, you can look at this list and say, yeah, I do all four. But they're not instantaneous, right? They have implications that will come at a cost. And therefore, you need to be able to determine which we ought to do first. Which is the one that you would say is going to be the one that's most important to start with. And then the other ones, the assumption is you'll come back to them, but what are you going to start with? So again, as you're thinking about this, as we launch the poll, thinking about answer 1, 2, 3, and 4, the first answer 1 is make it your top priority to work on the issues you've uncovered at Monte Vista. This is the greatest inequity you've discovered. Prioritize this. Answer number 2 is give work at the other 3 schools higher priority. Leverage the energy and desire they have around equity. Or answer number 3, make equity-focused principal meetings your first priority. If you develop real urgency and momentum with this group, it will draw the Monte Vista principals' attention to the issues at her school and support all 4 principals as they lead the charge, as they lead change. Or answer number 4, reach out to the Latino community to get their perspective. Latino families will offer important insights on what things need to happen at Monte Vista. So looking at this list, what do you think you'd do first? Again, not to say that any of these would not be important, but what would you do first if you had to in prioritizing your time? Take a look, note it if you will, and we will launch the poll. Give me one more second to think about it, to look at the choices. And here we go. Well, we seem to be gravitating towards one of the answers. Okay, I'll close the poll in 10 seconds. Okay, so as you can see, most people felt number 3, make equity-focused principals meetings their first priority. So that if you develop real urgency and momentum within this group, that obviously, getting the team together is going to be the fact that that's what you should prioritize. Anybody want to share why or why not this choice? Why you prioritize this over others?
This is Fermin from San Bernardino. I think, making equity, I think that's why we all got into the education of business. So kind of gaining momentum, gaining the force to be able to talk to not just that one principal, but to all principals to make sure we're all speaking the same language and moving towards the same goal would be helpful to everyone.
That's great. Yeah, getting alignment, building that coalition, so to speak, but also letting folks know that one thing we don't want to see happen, right, is that people feel isolated. That's really demotivating. It makes things even harder. So yeah, that's great in terms of thinking about how do we make them into a team and that they would feel supported, but and then they also can share their insights. That's great. Anybody else? So since this one was pretty clear, and again, just so we can get a little bit further into the sim, we'll do this one without going into the breakouts. But again, if anybody has anything to share, please either post it into chat or feel free to speak. And we will be able to proceed accordingly. with number 3.
How did your beliefs about equity play into how you chose to prioritize your time?
Okay, so here again, what we want to do is sometimes, not just capture the decision, but also have an opportunity to capture the thinking, as was shared by Fermin. And again, the opportunity to put some of these ideas down that, why we are going to prioritize this. And again, how we think about the other priorities, right? The other things are priorities too, but just not the top. But we can see that at least, doing this gave us some satisfaction from our outside stakeholders and to the board, getting that alignment. At least, perceptions can also be sometimes deceiving. We need to be careful. But here would be an opportunity to do that. And again, in the interest of moving things forward a little bit, we will go to the next choice and be able to see how we proceed. Okay, we'll see how things go.
You've decided to focus your principals meeting on equity for young men of color. You send a memo to principals letting them know this. Word of the meeting and your agenda gets around. The Deputy Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction pushes back, suggesting you need to give agenda time to other important district priorities such as STEM. You decide to combine topics and focus the principals on what it will take for young men of color to succeed at STEM. You plan to focus future site visits on how well STEM instruction is serving young men of color. At the same time, you recognize that for sites to take steps that bring about change, they will require more of your input and guidance, which will mean spending more time at Monte Vista.
Okay. And by the way, if something about this causes you to think or react in some way, please, either raise your hand or chat if you're comfortable sharing. Part of this is oriented around, being provocative, right? One of the clear differences in experience versus instruction is that, when we teach you the right way of things, right? We teach you what you need to know. We teach you the best way to do it. We teach you the process to follow, the 6 easy steps or difficult steps, but, the framework. When it comes to experience, every experience is a learning opportunity, and every experience has its unique aspects, right? And so this is just one experience. And if something about this, the way it's framed, the way it's presenting, the way it's going is say, well, it wouldn't happen that way in my school, or it wouldn't happen that way in my district, that's a perfect opportunity to provoke sharing, right? Because that's absolutely valid. And that's, again, that opportunity to be situationally aware, because your district, your school may have some unique elements to the context or personalities or what have you, or the challenges itself. And being able to provoke that in some way that is, again, collaborative in nature, that's non-confrontational, that's non-judgmental, it's a wonderful opportunity to surface different experiences. Because one of the things that we know about humans when it comes to adult learning is that we love stories, right? So the story itself can be engaging. The narrative can have, hook participants, or to hopefully you're experiencing that in a positive manner. But at the same time, we love to tell stories. We process information by telling our own stories or telling stories we're familiar with, because that's how we operate. And so creating an environment in which we can share our stories related to equity, and maybe it just takes a step aside. Yes, it's related to equity, but the implication is something else, or whatever the case may be. Getting this as part of the conversation is a very important component. And that's what we're looking to be able to do, because that's where that learning, that's where those unique aspects, which might otherwise go uncovered, get attended to.
You hear from the principal at Blue Creek High, who is eager for your assistance on the cultural competence work they are doing. She says she could really use your presence and your help facilitating an upcoming series of training sessions. What will you do?
And so here we have it, right? We're focusing on one issue, but there's so many more things on the plate, right? So how are we going to go about now responding to other priorities that we have? And this is a request from one of the other principals. So what will we do? We can reallocate some of the time we're spending at Monte Vista to work with the school instead. So a request shows interest, and interest should always be leveraged. Or answer 2, can see that you really need to reallocate time across your 4 schools, spending less time at Monte Vista. This is more than a one-off. You need to be sensitive to the needs of all your schools. Answer number 3, don't reallocate your time, but find a resource to support the cultural competence work at Blue Creek. Working with Principal Romero to find solutions at Monte Vista's retention issues needs your continued attention. Or answer number 4, encourage the principals to work with each other. This will allow you to focus your time where it is most needed at any given point. Give you a moment to process that. Think about it, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And I am sorry that I am just looking now at the, as you're thinking about this, I'm looking at the chat. And the question about encouraging females in STEM, absolutely, right? And it's very easy to get focused on one thing. And sometimes we don't want it to come at a cost. It doesn't diminish its importance, but there are other things as well. And sometimes, again, we can be provocative in this context in order to provoke things like that, or to make sure, and again, or other just different perspectives. And so absolutely, those are important components to raise and to make sure that they get discussed. And again, we can deal with one thing in the simulation, but then the important aspect is, what are the implications for us back in our systems, in our schools, in our work, individually or collectively. So please keep posting, and I'll help get to them as quickly as I can. And we are recording this, so for those interested, we can continue the conversation after as well. So with that, we'll put the poll out, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And here we go. How are we going to answer the request of another school? Okay, let's take about 10 more seconds. And we will end it now. So this one is a little less clear in the answers. So can see that you really need to reallocate time across all 4 schools. Spending less time on Monte Vista seems to be the one that won, if you will. But don't encourage all principals to work with each other. Got a good chunk there too. And we got a number of folks that would be with number 5, which is none of the above, but obviously you have something else in mind. Would anybody who did that like to share what they're thinking, what they would do? So one of the things we find, obviously it's, what do they say in law, right? Don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. We don't know, right? This is you want to have the opportunity for anonymity sometimes, which is great. So people feel safe to be able to share in this kind of manner. But the opportunity also from the perspective of when you're working with teams that that you're familiar with, the opportunity to provoke this and have that, that dialogue is going to be obviously critical. So let me stop this and let me put you into, since this one was a lot closer, let's see about putting you quickly into the breakouts so you can have some discussion about this and see if anything changes. We'll see you back in a few minutes. welcome back. So I am curious if we did a quick relaunch of the poll, curious to see if the answers come back the same way. So if you had whatever you chose, if you still feel that way, then just curious if we want to proceed along the same lines. So if you wouldn't mind voting again for the same choice. And if anybody changed their decision, so it seems like we're still going to, well, okay, well, so we've got some more fives. Anybody want to share? Did that come through your, in the discussion that people felt that there was another choice that they'd prefer to have? Because now we're tied with answer 2 and 5. So what were those who didn't like any of these choices, what would you do? Anybody want to share?
I'll share. I was in a breakout group and I changed my answer to 5 because I really liked what he shared. It's not that you don't like that option and have a different, it's that you have multiple answers. We like more answers that are there and versus seeing it as we don't like them and we have a different. So that's why I changed mine to 5 because I like more of the options.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're talking about it being a multi-pronged approach versus the one approach.
That's great. That's fabulous. So you do more than one of these, right? So we're forcing you down the path of one, but it sounds like, at least from that group, that you prefer not to be limited to that because you felt in terms of how you would implement, you would go, you would do things, you would do more than one of them, which
multi-tier.
Which is great. And again, that's the kind, we're going to force that again to provoke that kind of, yes, but you have to start with one, but it is important to recognize that it's not one and done from an implementation perspective, and that's wonderful perspective. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm glad that that came out in the conversation. Anybody else? Okay. So since I can't choose 5, we're going to choose 2, and let's see what happens. And again, just remember again how you're proceeding, and the opportunity for reflection comes into this at multiple levels, right? Because we're looking at the scenario, but it is important to also keep perspective on nothing happens. What are the downsides of doing scenario-based type things when it's just limited, like a case study? Is that it's not dynamic, right? It's you talk about the one thing and then it stops. Whereas life is actually plays out over time. You're dealing with a situation and a series of decisions that you need to make. So let's see how things progress.
Prioritize the 4 schools who are focused on equity, though you won't totally abandon your work with Monte Vista. However, after you reallocate your time, one of your colleagues mentioned that she overheard Mrs. Romero commenting at a recent all principals meeting that she hopes maybe the district has finally straightened its priorities out and will leave her school alone to do the great work for which it is known.
That never happens, does it?
You come into the office and learn that a number of Monte Vista parents have called the district office to complain. Apparently, the principal told them her new supervisor has been criticizing their school, saying they weren't focused enough on students who, frankly, weren't prepared to be there in the first place. The parents want to keep standards high at their school. Monte Vista's excellent academic performance is a key reason they send their children there. Unfortunately, a number of parents from Blue Creek High School have also called to complain. At a recent PTA meeting, teachers mentioned that the staff work on cultural competence wasn't going as smoothly as it should. The PTA committed to this work at the beginning of the school year. This equity work is so important to the student experience at Blue Creek. A show of district support for this work would go a long way with some of the teachers who view it just as a pet project of the principal's. But the principal has revealed that she's reached out to the district for assistance, but her requests have been denied. It seems that the associate superintendent is spending a lot of time at Monte Vista High. Our students may not be as affluent as the Monte Vista kids, but they deserve just as much time and attention. You resolve to convene a parent meeting across all your schools to address their concerns about resource distribution. What will your message be to parents?
So never easy, huh? There's always those stakeholders. Everybody has needs, and I joke sometimes when I teach. You know, I've been doing simulations for over 30 years, and only more recently in K-12. And having worked with leaders from around the world, I would suggest to you that from multiple different industries, that the job of the school administrator and teacher, I think, would be included in that, is probably the most pathetic leadership job I've come across. And I mean that with great respect, because nowhere have I seen a job where the stake, as I mentioned before, the stakes are so high and the decisions are themselves so inherently complex that it's exacerbated by a group of stakeholders whose demands are so exclusive of each other, and that each one is, if you'll forgive me, more irrational than the next. So really, no matter what you do, it's going to upset somebody, and it doesn't diminish the rightness of what you're doing, but it does mean that you have to be able to respond and navigate accordingly, even if it's complicated. So here we have, now how do we respond? How are we gonna message to the parents more broadly? So limited resources mean forced choices. We can't do it all. Or answer 2 is you'll begin spending more time at the other schools while continuing to support Monte Vista in its efforts related to equity. Or answer 3, assistance from the community would enable us to do more within the current constraints. If this is sufficiently important to the community, then their time and assistance is greatly needed. So maybe message it, directing it towards them as well. So why don't we think about what you want to do here. I'll open up the polls.
And I don't know if I'm only seeing 3 options on the screen.
This one only has 3.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, sometimes there'll be 2, sometimes there'll be 3, sometimes there'll be more, right? The goal is the critical thinking, not necessarily that we have the opportunity to capture every possible choice, but this way you're going to choose kind of a direction. Okay, we'll give about 5 more seconds. Okay. So this seems to be is close between answer 3 and answer 2. So pushing it back onto the community, asking them for their resources, or that you will let people know that you're going to spend more time on the other schools. Anybody want to share? We're running towards the end of our time together. So anybody want to share quickly what drove your choice? Okay. Just so we can see what happens, I'm going to make the decision so you can see it. And we're happy to talk if any of you are interested in, and I'll leave it to Robert when we're done to come back relative to the opportunity within CALSA for these. But
what will you say to parents? What do you hope to achieve?
So here we get a little bit more into the messaging.
One of the parents present at the meeting responds to you. We're tired of hearing about limited resources. Resources are always limited. I'm sure no one in this room wants to say this, so I guess I will have to be the one. You're spending your time at the school that serves white kids. That's obviously the school that you think is most important.
Okay.
During the break between semesters, you find yourself thinking about organizing visits to other schools to learn what they are doing to support male students of color. You make a note to gather some information toward that goal. You also find time to talk with a former colleague about your situation. He says, but how are you moving things for children of color? You've talked about doing things, but what decisions are you making? You recognize the need to take action.
So I'm going to leave it at that. There is more. What I wanted to do real quickly is show you
what are you going to do now?
What the end looks like if we were to get all the way to the end.
As you look to managing expectations going forward. So your priorities are, as you consider what will be your approach with the principal moving forward. You provided Mrs. Romero with moving forward. How will you focus principals' meetings and shape?
So clearly there is
As your first
what
year
to do
winds down,
in
you
this
recognize
context.
it is now at this point,
So now we get to
you
the
have
end.
completed the equity exploring beneath the surface simulation.
So we would get this final feedback relative to our stakeholders, but then from the opportunity. Sorry about that. We did actually get, I breezed through it. That was an email message. We do get some interruptions on occasion. So there are a number of other variables that are at play that you get feedback on as well. And this is it's not an assessment. It's to provide insight into what are some of those trade-offs that were at play in the various decisions that were made. So on the one hand, there's your risk profile, act versus plan, and take risk versus avoid risks. So every decision affects these variables in some way, shape, or form, right? There's decision-making, ethical versus emotional, competence versus compliance, leadership versus friendship, set priorities versus distilled priorities, collaboration versus solo. And again, you can see how, in the decisions that we made, this may provide some insight into why things went well or why things didn't go as well. In communication, broad versus focused.
Feedback on the following screens is intended.
Again,
a reporter from the local paper has been contacted.
So again, local paper. So there are some nonlinear interruptions that would take place, but just to show you what the feedback would look like is we remind you at the end of the sim, here's the opportunity to reflect on the entirety of the experience. So as you can see up in the corner here, you have 1 of 9. So there were 9 decisions that were made. We remind you what the decision was, what the learning objectives in that scenario were, remind you of your choice, and then the specific feedback on that choice. So this way you get some insight and again, provoke additional discussion amongst the team because you may agree or disagree with the feedback, right? Because it may not reflect the realities in your context. And that's another opportunity for that meaningful conversation about the issue and what we should do about it in our context. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions and certainly happy to respond to them and also turn it back over to if Jeanette has any closing, if you have any closing remarks, and then back to you, Robert. So first, any questions?
And the reason that we're bringing this to you, not only is it relevant right now, but also because there's many simulations and it's a safe place to practice prior to seeing them live in your district or in your current situation. So if you have any questions about the type of sims or things like that, you're more than welcome to. You have Ken here today.
I have a question. So is this like set up that a person could do it individually and then they could discuss it, but they could go through it individually? We're doing it as a group today, but how would it normally work?
So that is actually up to you. It depends on the constraints. They're browser-based, so they can be done obviously in a Zoom. They can be done face-to-face when that becomes an option again, or they can be assigned individually and done asynchronously. In that instance, again, it depends on how you want, what you want to wrap around it. We distinguish between the idea of the instruction and the experience, and both are important. And the clear benefit is when you blend them together, right? So when you teach and then allow for the application or the discovery. And so you can wrap whatever assignments you want around it, but then you can deploy it however you choose to. And the nice thing about it is also that as you think about this, right? So now we have in this group, right? So if I were to see you in a week from now or 2 weeks from now, when we got into a discussion about equity, but we're coming from different places, different schools, different districts, different states. We now have a shared context, right? We know this Superintendent Williams. We can refer to Superintendent Williams and not be worried that we're talking about somebody who may hear what we say about them. Or we can talk about the principals, we can talk about the board members, the parents, whatever the case may be, and we all know who we're talking about. So the opportunity to provoke meaningful conversation that goes way beyond the value of the exercise, especially when you're dealing even beyond the scale of a school building or a district, just gives you additional fodder, if you will, for that meaningful type of conversation, again, whether you're doing them synchronously or asynchronously. So thank you for that question. And as Robert mentioned, these are the list of simulations in the library that are available within the categories. Each one of these is pretty much similar in approach to what you saw. It's just around it's in a different context. It's in a different, dealing with a different problem of practice, and can be utilized to provoke conversation, however it serves the objectives that you have for your constituencies.
And Fermin had a question. Yes, Fermin, it is for professional development, for schools, for school districts. ALAS has used it for the Superintendent's Academy. CALSA has used it for its mentoring program, just to sharpen our tools there.
And so you know that we're actually going to be part of the Four Corners is implementing, the Four Corners affiliates are launching a leadership academy as well. And the simulations will be embedded in that.
And then Yvonne said, how do we get those modules? Are we providing anything at this point to those that attended today that they can?
So we'll provide access to a link. It's actually to the cultural competency sim that you can go and experience and have access to. And we'd love to, if you have any direct questions, feel free to reach out either through Robert or directly to us. And we would very much look forward to connecting and speaking with you, as we are with Jeanette in San Diego County Office of Education, and with others in California and within other states as well.
And Dr. Chien, how are you using it right now at San Diego County Office of Ed, and how have you used it in the past?
So we're just starting our partnership with Ken and the idea of using Sims, but the way that I thought about using it, and we are going to be implementing it, is we oversee the preliminary administrative credential program and the clear credential program. So those people who are enrolled as either aspiring administrators or those that are clearing their credentials, we're bringing them together and using the Sims as part of the coursework and part of their coaching. One of the things that the state requires is that our folks coach individual administrators, and we thought it's great that you have coaching based on your individual context, but it's also important to have other people come together who are new or who are experiencing a lot of the same things that others are experiencing, so that they have the conversations again in a safe place. One of the things I wanted to point out was that yes, everybody has a different context, and relationships are important, the context is important, but at the end of the day, it's about doing the right thing for kids. And so again, this gives people the opportunity to talk through their thinking, to talk through their strategy, and to be able to share best practices. And so that's how we're using it right now with our aspiring administrators and our new administrators. But we also are thinking about using this with our own team. We have people who go out and coach principals who aren't new, who are experienced principals, and especially for people who don't have a lot of background in addressing equity. And so we're thinking about using this with our own internal team who supports districts and schools. So anyway, I know that Ken, you had also said if I had any closing words. I think my closing words are, it's important for us as leaders of school systems, districts, and even classrooms if we have teachers here, that we take a leadership stance of action. So again, it's important to have these conversations around equity, but I think the simulation points out to the idea of We need to have the conversations, and then we need to be intentional and strategic about the actions we take. And just know, everyone, that the kids that you serve deserve this. They deserve your leadership, and they deserve to have us to be intentional again around how we address issues that impact them directly. And just remember, si se puede.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Jeanette. Thank you all of those that participated. And when we have another sim in the future, we'll set the expectation that we're going to be having breakout rooms and all that. If you want to join us for another simulation, just let me know what type of topics you're looking into. We'll send you a follow-up email. It'll come from calsa@ed-link.org. We'll provide you a link there for your simulation that CALSA is providing you through our partnership with SchoolSims. And if you're not a CALSA member, you're welcome to join us. Very great organization to be a part of, especially if you're looking to be part of a network that really is like a big family, and you're looking to connect with other leaders and really grow in your career. And thank you so much all for joining and taking time to be with us. And have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette.
Thanks, Ken. Hope your rest of the week goes well.
You too. Feel better.
Thank you. I'll try.
And I hope you find some way to get away.
Yeah, I'll try my best.
I will be in touch.
All right. Perfect. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.